Continuing debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise with thanks to the member for Sackville, Preston Chesapeake, for sharing some of his time to afford me the opportunity to do so. And I think earlier it was another colleague who said he had some kind of mixed feelings about today's motion, because there's a lot that's true in today's motion, particularly the first parts that name and provide some useful facts and figures about the very difficult situation that Canadians are facing. We know that many Canadians right now are concerned about losing a place to live, whether that's because the interest rate on their mortgage has gone up and they're not sure that their family income can absorb the additional costs. It could be because rents continue to climb. For various reasons, but certainly one important reason is the corporate presence in the Canadian housing market that continues. In Winnipeg, for instance, we just saw Lyons Place be offered up to a private developer who has a history of taking over buildings where there used to be affordable rents, doing some superficial renovation, and then jacking up the cost of rent. So that activity is going on, it's happening, and it's a real challenge, putting pressure on the cost of rent. We know that Canadians are struggling with the 11% increase in the cost of groceries, and that puts pressure on household budgets. It's not an optional extra that people can choose to do without. It's a cost that they either have to absorb, or, as the member for Victoria was just pointing out, go hungry because they don't have any good alternatives. So we are facing a really difficult moment. Where I take issue with the motion before us is that it would lay all of that problem at the feet of government and suggest that the answer, that it's sufficient just to, well, let's read it. Cap government spending, cut waste, fire high-priced consultants, eliminate inflationary deficit and taxes that have caused a cost of living crisis for Canadians. There's, again, some truth in that. Like, I'm in favor of cutting waste, for instance, but I think my Conservative colleagues and I might have some differences of opinion as to what constitutes a proper cutting of waste and what's properly wasteful and what's not. So I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker. I've been doing a lot of advocacy alongside folks outside of Parliament, like Campaign 2000, for a CERB low-income repayment amnesty. I think it is wasteful to chase the poor for money they don't have because they took the government at its word during a global crisis of unprecedented proportion, that if they needed help, they should apply for it. And when it turned out that they weren't quite eligible because they weren't poor in the right way, the government is now saying, you owe us all of that money back, and we're going to pay people to hound you, even though we know that you don't have the money and we will never get that money back. We're going to throw good money after bad. That's waste. If that's what the Conservatives mean by cut waste, well, I'm here, I'll show up any day of the week for that. I suspect it's not what they mean when they say cut waste, because I've heard them talk about other things that I value and that I think are good investments. So, for instance, when we talk about pharmacare on this side of the House, that is a cost. So capping spending isn't going to allow us to have a federal pharmacare plan. But you know what a federal pharmacare plan will do? Ultimately save money for Canadians and reduce the cost of accessing prescription drugs in Canada, not just in individual budgets, but in government budgets too. So the latest reports pre-pandemic on pharmacare in Canada said that Canadians were paying about $24 billion a year on prescription drugs. That was a combination of government expenditure, private insurance plan expenditure, and out-of-pocket expenditure. And the findings of many different studies over time, but in this particular example with those particular numbers, was that a national pharmacare plan would cost about $20 billion a year. So depending on who pays and what ledger it's on, Canadians stand to save at least $4 billion a year on the prescription drugs that they're currently buying. They're already buying those drugs. So to me, to say the federal government should just arbitrarily cap its spending when there are investment opportunities that could reduce cost to Canadians overall is not the right approach. And I think we should be more discerning in our judgments around this place in a way that this motion simply is not. I would say also that we've seen a lot of change, and we're going to see more change in the economy over the years to come, particularly in regard to energy. We're seeing that happen already. Many of our allies are trying to lower their dependency on fossil fuel. That's happening, whether Canada wants it or not, whether Canada gets on board or not. That is something that's happening. It's happening for the sake of the climate. It's also happening for the sake of energy security. And I don't think anybody in this place needs a lecture on that after the last 12 months. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and what's happened to global energy supply, but also the real pinch that Russia's supply of oil to Europe and other parts of the world, the power that has given it. So there are many reasons why the world is trying to lower its dependency on fossil fuel for basic things that you can't do without, like heating your home. Canada's choice is whether it shows up to that or not. Now, back in the 70s, Peter Lougheed made real investments, and the federal government also made real investments to create the oil and gas industry that exists in Alberta today. That was not a spontaneous creation of the free market, not by far. There was a lot of very deliberate policy work and financial investment by governments in order to create the oil and gas economy of the late 20th century. And anyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves, and they're kidding anyone who's listening. The moment before us is another moment of policy and financial investment to create a new energy economy for the next 50 years, at least. Canada has to decide whether it wants to get on that train. We're not going to get on that train for free, which means arbitrarily capping spending right now just takes Canada out of the game at a time when the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is representing our continental partner, our biggest continental partner, finally getting into the climate change game in a meaningful way. And a lot of companies that are also making incredible amounts of profit that are in the new energy economy are sizing up the places where they want to invest in that. And we should value that investment as much as we value investment in the oil and gas sector, but Canada doesn't. It values investment in oil and gas, and it has not shown up for other industries, particularly not new energy industries, in the way not only that it showed up for oil and gas in the 70s, but that it continues to show up for oil and gas today. Just think of the over $20 billion that the federal government found overnight to get into the pipeline business, which is a business they have no business being in the first place. So don't tell me there isn't money for other important things. Of course there is. The Liberals have proven it by going out and spending on things like pipelines, which they shouldn't have done. So we're in this moment where we are trying to address critical challenges for individual Canadian households and many businesses at the same time that are still reeling from the effects of the pandemic. We're in a moment when the world is preparing and laying the foundations for the next generation economy. And it's important to my children and to the children of people in this place and across the country that Canada get that right, so that good paying union jobs are available to the next generation of Canadian children in the same way that those jobs were available for oil and gas workers in Alberta. We want to make sure that those jobs continue to be available. Some of them will be in oil and gas, but there's going to be less of those in the future, not because the Canadian government of any stripe decided that that was going to be the case, but because many governments the world over are deciding that must be the case if we're going to have a planet to have an economy on in the first place. They're not wrong about that, and Canada needs to get with the program. We're only going to be able to do that through serious investment. I'll close because I know my time is running short, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your diligence. Just to mention healthcare, I don't know that we need to do much more than that, but the idea that we're going to solve the very real problems in the health system without investment is false. And so in this time when people are struggling to get access to care, government will need to make investments. Provincial governments have been willing to pay through the nose for private agency nurses working overtime to send people to the United States to get treatment. That is not a health system. We need to build it here. We need to rebuild it here. That will require investment. It's worth paying for, and it's why it's not the time to endorse a simple spending cap. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people for Kamloops Thompson Caribou. Before I begin my question, I do want to recognize the life of former mayor of Kamloops, Cliff Branchflower, who passed away earlier this week. I wish his family the best in this difficult time. Now, Mr. Speaker, my colleague mentioned that we're going to have decreased oil and gas jobs in the future, not because this government wants it, but because all governments really want that. Here's the thing. As it stands right now, it seems as though this government wants less oil and gas jobs and wants them less in Alberta. But in cases where we're looking at and considering how much oil and gas is required today, we're all going to get off oil and gas. That's his point. But while we are weaning off oil and gas, does he not agree that those good-paying jobs that could be located in Canada should stay in Canada as opposed to countries that do not have the respect for wages and human rights? Because that's where those jobs are going right now. Why aren't they staying in Canada?
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I would say this is the example of the kind of 1-2 punch that the oil and gas industry gets in this House between Liberals and Conservatives. The Liberals spent over $20 billion now on a pipeline. And the Conservatives get up and say they don't support the oil and gas industry. Now, you can debate if you want to support the oil and gas industry with massive government expenditure or whether you should or not. But the fact of the matter is, I would say the Liberals have been trying really hard to support the oil and gas industry. I don't think that they're not trying. In fact, I criticize them for the extent to which they do that, because I think that the opportunity cost of that $20 billion investment, when we're told, oh, we can't have a Western power grid that would help share hydroelectric energy from British Columbia and Manitoba across the provinces, we can't do that. We don't have the money to build it. And then they turn around and build a $20 billion pipeline. Is we can't afford to be sinking that much money in new oil and gas infrastructure when we could be spending that money on different types of infrastructure that will also create really good quality jobs here in Canada. So the point is to create those jobs and to do it in a way that's going to be sustainable over time. And I would say the Liberals have placed their bet in the oil and gas industry. We think that's the wrong place to place that bet for the next generation of Canadian workers.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech. I agree with him. The Liberals have invested more money in the oil and gas industry than the Conservatives did before them. It's more than we've ever seen before, I think, in Canadian history. There has never been so much in the way of subsidies to the industry. My question, unfortunately, is the following, and I'm not sure my colleague will be happy with it, but at this point, we're fighting climate change, and we see that this government is investing record amounts in oil and gas subsidies. How can his party support them when it comes to voting on such a budget?
Nous reconnaissons que les Canadiens
We recognize that Canadians voted in the last election. We recognize what they voted for. We're here to make progress on the issues we can. I don't think that an election tomorrow will settle the fact that Liberals and Conservatives are subsidizing the oil and gas sector. We want to change that. We are working with people in Canada and Quebec who want to change that. But we're not there yet. We're at a place where there will be a federal dental care program. We do think that's good. So we will take the successes that we can, and we will continue to fight where we must.
I'll probably pay for this comment, but saving the best for last. The honourable questions and comments. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would be inclined to ask a quick question in regards to what the member thinks about the NDP Liberal BC agreement on LNG, or I could possibly ask him what he believes Rachel Notley has to say about the purchase of the pipeline. But rather, I want to pick up on what his speech was about in regards to how government can actually spend where there's there's a very high return, and if I can get his thoughts in regards to the National Child Care Program and the net benefits of that, which was clearly demonstrated in the province of Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you. I am very familiar with the arguments in favor of a national child care program. I recall making them as a candidate in 2015 against Liberals who said that it was a bad idea and it wasn't the federal government's business investing in child care. I'm very glad to see the government come around on that, and I'm glad to see some of the positive effects that were anticipated by New Democrats and others who knew better. And so welcome to the party. I hope you'll join us on some other things while we're at it.